Good morning, ladies and germs. This is your Bernie Sanders and coronavirus update. It's the 23rd. Uh, oh my. Well, first off, all the numbers are not in as of this morning when I'm recording this. However, for those numbers that are, Sanders has a shocking lead. Wow. Just wow. In delegates, by the way, the last update that I'm seeing here on the various major news sites is from about 1 o'clock in the morning. Here's the interesting thing that on the popular vote side, and it looks like we have some. We have like one small area of Nevada. Well, it's not really that small landmass, just north of Las Vegas. One basic county sort of area that has no results in, and we have one area that Warren won, and a couple of areas outside of any of the major metro areas that the butt gig run, butt plug. And Sanders wiped the floor with the rest. Now, this is an especially interesting thing. And by the way, it was not close. Okay, it was a drubbing. Popular vote, Sanders is 24,122. The next closest was Biden with 11,087. That's a better than 2-to-1 margin. Which, by the way, and that's after the realignment, okay? It was almost exactly 2-to-1 on the first round of ballots. And then, of course, what ends up happening is that, those people who lost, you either have your option to drop out as a voter and go home, or you can go ahead and realign with somebody else. Now, what's very interesting in this is that during the second round, Warren actually lost votes. Now, everybody else you expect to, because they're just not in the game. Klobuchar, Steyer, and ultimately, Gabbard was the worst in that regard. Tulsi went from 220 to 0 when I'm sorry, no, not 0. She had 6. I'm wrong. 6. Was that her dog? I know, it's terrible. But when you get to it in delegates, it's equally bad news. At the county level, Sanders has 46.6%, and Biden 19.2%. So it's better than a 2-to-1 blowout. Butt plug is at 15.4. Warren's at 10, and Klobuchar, forget it. She's in the single digits, 4.5. She didn't crack 5. Her outcome was essentially identical statistically to Steyer. Okay, who? Oh my! Remember, Bloomberg's not on the ballot here. Okay, but what I think is very interesting about this is that Las Vegas and the unions there came out strongly against Sanders. And yet, Sanders won Clark County. I think it just goes to tell you, folks, that when you look at how this all works, I think you're gonna have a big surprise, because Nevada is a state that you go 10 minutes out of town, and I don't know if you could find a Democrat. But swing a dead cat around, you're going to hit a Republican. I mean, it's the rural and city mix. Pardon me, the coffee's good. That you see everywhere else. But Sanders actually won the Democratic contest in Clark County in Las Vegas, and also in Reno and Carson City, which again is something to pay a lot of attention to. I think says a great deal. And this was not close. All right. Now you got South Carolina, and then you got Super Tuesday, of course. But this is now coming up in the next week and change. And the problem the rest of these candidates have is that, with the exception of Steyer, who's of course got a shitload of money and can fund, he can stay in for as long as he feels like wasting cash. Beyond Super Tuesday, if you see numbers that look anything like this, I mean anything like them at all, okay, then the money's just going to dry up. All right, butt plug is done. Warren is done. Klobuchar's had it. Gabbard, she just has nowhere to go. But she was effectively out of the race before, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, she's still on ballot. But the real problem here is that Biden is done. Okay, so I think what you're going to see here, and this is, I think this is going to be kind of interesting. I think what this is going to devolve down into is Sanders versus Bloomberg. And we'll see, because things can change in South Carolina. Of course, Biden is making a lot of noise about how he's going to be very strong there. He's going to be the guy, and da da da. I don't know about that. I really don't know about that. But I will say this: of the candidates that don't have black problems, Sanders and Biden are probably in the best position, and you have a multicultural situation in South Carolina. But here's what goes with that. You do in Nevada to a large degree too. The demographics in Nevada look an awful lot like they do in the United States as a whole. Now that is not, there was a lot of hay being made about that a couple days ago. I almost wrote an article on it, and I thought about it, and I said, yeah, I'll save it for the podcast because we got the caucus, right? It's coming in a couple days. The thing is, what you have is the nation as a whole doesn't tell you what happens in the Democrat-laden areas. Okay, so it is true that Nevada has a demographic profile that looks an awful lot like the nation as a whole, taken as a state. Now, of course, that's not true when you separate things out into metropolitan areas and rural areas. Never has been, never will be. It's just, it is what it is. But when you look at the Democrat strongholds, you take a place like Chicago. Okay, Chicago is approximately 1/3 white, 1/3 black, 1/3 Hispanic. And then, you've got a very sizable Asian population, things like this. But I mean, but if you want to get down to rough demographics, it's about what it looks like. That's Chicago. That's not the nation as a whole. The nation as a whole, I think it's, where are we? About 13% black. I think that's about right. And Hispanics are 10-ish or something like this. And that's just kind of the deal. Okay, yeah, all right. So I'm looking at this right now, the 2010 census. So that's kind of interesting. You had 14% according to the 2010 census, and that's multiracial black. Okay, so that includes people, I guess, you'd call them mulatto. That's kind of a slam, right? I mean, I think it's kind of bullshit. But and then you got HHS, which says that as of 2017, is 12.7%. So 13, 14, somewhere in there. So that you have somewhere around between 10 and 12 in Nevada. This is but this is not the Democrat stronghold demographic. Illinois is full of white people in the rural areas, but in Chicago, black people are a third of the population. There is no majority race in Chicago. The plurality is almost equally split between whites, blacks, and Hispanics. And that's just the way it is. And that plays out in a huge number of metropolitan areas that lean heavily blue. I've been that way for a long time. It's not anything new. So I think you have to be a little bit careful here. But again, if I'm going to look at who has black problems, butt plug will pull disastrously in places like Chicago. All right, Warren will pull terribly, except again, Warren has a vagina factor. Okay, so she gets female votes that she otherwise wouldn't get, maybe even among people that would hold their nose and vote for her, as opposed to be a real supporter. Klobuchar had that as a factor, but she's in the dust at this point. She's done. And so you could take Klobuchar, you could take Gabbard, you could take Steyer they're off the table in terms of actually having a chance at the nomination. They're finished. And frankly, I think you take Warren off the table after South Carolina, and certainly after Super Tuesday. And my suspicion is butt plug's gone too. So how long does Biden hold on depends on how long his money holds out. My guess is he's finished. I did a preliminary copy of this podcast last night before I went to bed, and Sanders was wiping the floor with them then, but this is even worse. I mean, he was just under 2-1. Now he actually strengthened his lead in the few hours before they stopped reporting things. So now again, only 50% of the precincts are in, so this could shift. But the idea that he's going to lose is that's just not going to happen. We'll see what happens when the totals are actually in and all is said and done and all this. Okay, let's talk coronavirus. This is to me one of the things that I think is interesting is that we got the latest numbers in from China. And we're supposedly 76,900 now for the 22nd. The 23rd is the same number, so no update. Folks, please realize something. Any number you're getting out of China at this point is bullshit. And the reason is they keep changing their methodology, and so it's just bullshit. However, what we need to be paying attention to now is that there's very clearly a problem in South Korea. Very bad. They've had a couple of doublings here in the last few days. That's not the sort of thing you want to see. I'm extremely concerned about those sorts of numbers. I really don't like that. The only good news is that when you look at this, what you have is a cluster, essentially all of these new cases, in a cluster down around this church. It's in the southeast corner of the country, an area that is not full of white people sanitation. Good. So there's that. We still have no breakout in the United States. We still have no breakout in other countries, but we do have some people in Italy. We've had I don't know that I quite call it a breakout yet, but that's a problem. We've had a few cases in Iran. All of these, by the way, isn't it kind of funny that among the Italian, I've done a quick survey of the Italian news that I can find. Nobody's talking about who they are. Nobody's talking about whether they're part of the shithole migration that came out of Africa. And basically all these people that wipe their butts with their hands. Nobody is putting demographics on this thing. No one. In fact, people are studiously avoiding this discussion with South Korea, which is very stupid. South Korea as a nation is very westernized. In fact, they try to be more Western than Western if you go into Seoul and places like that. South Korea outside of those areas, however, specifically outside of the northern half, because remember we had the Olympics over there. And prior to the Olympics, when they were doing the construction, and this was just a few years ago because it was the Winter Olympics, the South Korean government, as part of making the area safe for the Olympics and to build all this infrastructure, they went in there, they ripped out all of the pit toilets and the whole floor stuff, and put Western toilets, sit on the throne, flush them, and actually the waste goes somewhere because they have some money over there. And so, isn't it funny that they have a super spread outbreak, and guess where it happens? In a church and around a church, and a community hospital, and apparently a psychiatric hospital, which is very bad, but in the part of the country that didn't get that sort of build-out. There was also one case detected in that immediate area at a Samsung factory. That factory has been shut down, and they're disinfecting it, whatever, and they're saying they're going to restart production on Monday. We'll see how long that lasts. Be very careful with trying to read anything into that, okay? Same thing with Italy. Who are these people? All right? Why haven't we seen breakouts? Now, remember, Australia, okay, right now is basically in the middle of their summer, right? Because, Southern Hemisphere, right? Seasons are backwards, okay? Australia's in the middle of summer, getting into the fall, and so, their winter is going to be coming, all right? But they've had no breakout. Germany hasn't had any breakout. We haven't had any breakout. We've got these people we repatriated and used as a human petri dish. And incidentally, the people at the CDC who were probably responsible for this, Trump apparently, according to reports, is furious that they did this, that they didn't tell him that they were going to put these people on the same airplane that had tested positive, supposedly in isolation. Yeah, right. Pull the other one. There's only one air source, asshole. All right. So, anybody that's running that bullshit, I don't believe a minute of it. But we will see if there's any transmission between those people. It's very important because those are American citizens. They are probably American citizens who actually are American. In other words, they probably sit on the toilet, they probably use TP, and they wash their hands. Well, at least some of the time they wash their hands. But they don't throw their toilet paper in the trash. They don't shit on the floor. And now we have another piece of news that came out just in the last day or so, and I'm trying to get confirmation on this and run it down. I haven't been able to do it yet, that the virus shows up in urine. I really hope that's wrong. Urine normally is sterile, folks. I don't know if you're aware of that. A lot of people are not, probably because, piss is nasty, right? But urine normally, in a healthy person, is sterile. No bacteria in it, no viruses in it. It's mostly urea and water. But if the virus is being shed in urine, then you got a whole different class of trouble, because now you're going to have people, how about San Francisco? How about L.A.? How about Austin, where they've got a homeless problem there, too? What? Oh, boy. You think people taking a shit all over the sidewalk is bad news. People piss all over the place, too, in those places, and you piss more often than you shit. In fact, 4 or 5 times as often, most people, per day. So the opportunity to really cause trouble is much larger if, in fact, that's true. Got to see whether or not that bears out. But I'm very unhappy if that is the case. And then secondly, here's the other thing to think about, folks. Ever go into a sort of a dive bar? What frequently happens about 10 or 11 o'clock after people start getting drunk? How many of them, get, oh, my dick is much bigger than I thought it was, and man, it is huge after you have about 4 or 5 beers in you, and your aim sucks because you're kind of stumbling, and all right, come on, we've all seen that, right? Nasty bathroom. Well, guess what? Not using said nasty bathroom, not going into it, may become part of a gotta do it kind of situation here in the United States if this thing pans out. And man, where are we headed here, folks? Maybe some bad news. Again, if you are not prepared to bug in, and, look, if my hypothesis continues to hold, and I think it will, you're going to get some spotty little, people are going to say spot fires, brush fires, whatever. You're going to, at some point, some jackass is going to get into the United States with an undetected viral load. Well, it's already happened. Okay, we've had a couple of cases where somebody gets into the country, they come back from China before everybody knew to lock this shit down, and they sleep with their husband or their wife, and their husband or their wife gets it, and they both end up sick, and then oh shit, But here's the thing. Notice. Remember, we had these cases there was a couple in Chicago. There's a couple in the other parts of the United States. What hasn't happened yet? And at this point, we are well beyond the 2-3 week period when it should have. All right, because remember, we started getting these cases reported in the U.S. Quite a little while ago. All right, and so as a result, if there was going to be easy person-to-person transmission in the U.S., remember, the question isn't can you give it to people? Of course, the answer to that is yes. The question is how hard is it and what are the conditions under which it occurs? And when I started talking about this with the virus, was about a month ago on the podcasts. Okay, that was about where this was, right? If you remember, because it was right about the time that the impeachment thing was dying. Okay, about a week before the impeachment was over. This was part of the daily feature of the podcast. Now we're about a month later. All right, so there's people say, oh no, the contagious period is 21 days. Okay, the guys and gal who were in Chicago. Remember, we had the individual who had recently traveled to China. Then he turns up sick. Then his intimate turns up sick. Big shock, right? You're sleeping with that person. Those people were walking around in the community for some period of time while contagious, because we know that this is the case, while able to transmit the virus, and they didn't transmit the virus. Nobody else got sick. And yet they were out in the general public. I'm assuming they went to the store, they went to work, they did, maybe they went to church, whatever. White man sanitation good. They didn't infect anybody. Because if they had, it would have been reported by now. And again, if you have a subclinical infection, in other words, you get it, but you don't get sick, or you don't get sick enough to go see a doctor, then nobody cares. And nobody knows about it, for that matter. And as I pointed out, I might have had this. I don't know. I had a atypical flu kind of presentation, a little over a month ago. And it was very atypical for flu, but it definitely it was respiratory, but it wasn't an upper respiratory thing. It wasn't a cold, and it did have some fever, but not much. I mean, it wasn't anything big. It was it ran a temperature of about 100 for one night, a very very slight fever for a second, and then I had that nagging hangs-on cough kind of thing going on for a while, and that was enough to get me concerned, because there's a little bit of rails in there, and that's you start getting that stuff, and you start wondering. Okay, now I don't have a stethoscope. Maybe I ought to go buy one, but I don't have one, so wasn't really sure if it was right up in the upper part of in the throat, or whether it was down the lungs. But when you start getting that sort of symptomology, you pay attention, because if that deteriorates, that's exactly the kind of thing that sends you to the hospital with pneumonia. All right. All right. So I want to leave you with one other thought. Okay, and that is, if we get into a situation in the United States where there actually is sustained spread, this is one of the reasons that you need to be thinking about: can I bug in? Is there a way to do it? And it's this: we have about 1 million hospital beds in the United States, approximately, across the entire country. Probably 10% of those at most are empty at any given point in time. So if there is an outbreak in the U.S., if you think that there's going to be the availability to handle more than about 10% of the population, you're smoking crack. Or population, 10% of the existing capacity, so about 100,000 people, you're smoking crack. Now, it gets much worse. How many of those rooms are negative pressure? Remember that most people go to the hospital not, this is very important, because they have an infectious disease, but because they have some kind of acute or chronic health condition that gets them in very serious trouble and threatens to kill them. You have a heart attack, you have a stroke, You have COPD. You have cancer. Okay. Now, in virtually every one of these cases, when other than an infectious disease is involved, what you want for the patient is positive pressure in the hospital room. And the reason is, if I have cancer and you're dosing me up with chemotherapy and radiation and everything else, you're whacking the living hell out of my immune system. And it is very, very important that if you do that, that you keep me from getting anything else. Because if I do get something else, I'm probably going to die. And so you put me in a room that has positive pressure, atmospheric feed from outside the hospital environment, so the guy that walks by with a hacking cough doesn't get me sick. Very important. Unfortunately, if I have an infectious disease, you want the exact opposite. You want negative pressure. Because now your concern is that if I have a hacking cough and I'm the patient and I'm contagious, that I'm going to get everybody else in the building sick. So you have a negative pressure environment where air gets drawn in from the surrounding environment, gets exhausted out of the room, and so anything that gets into the room can't get beyond the room. Both of these sorts of environments require some sealing, some gasketing, caulking, things like this, and a substantial amount of airflow. And the interesting thing about negative pressure room design in hospitals, which a lot of people don't realize, is there's actually two zones. One of them is the room itself, and then a second one at a greater negative pressure, in other words, isolated from the rest of the room, is the head. Gee, I wonder why that is. You think these people didn't think of this, huh? Oh, yes, they did. All right? Not specifically for coronavirus, but yeah, this is reality, okay? Why? Because a decent number of highly infectious diseases have this problem, that the bathroom is the last place you want anything getting out of. All right? So if it's going to get out, it has to get out, where it can't get anybody else. How many of the rooms in hospitals are negative pressure? I don't know. I have been digging around for the last day and a half trying to find stats on this. I can't. I think it is a fair bet that a very small percentage of hospital rooms, in fact, are. And if they're not, you're going to have what you're essentially going to have is a sanitarium kind of situation develop very rapidly in all developed countries if you do get breakouts. In fact, there was just an injunction issued by a judge out in California. There was an attempt by the federal government to essentially do exactly that with a medical facility that had been closed and use it exclusively for those people. And some idiot judge seems to think that there's a community transmission risk here. No, but if anybody that goes in there is sick, okay, has this bug, then you make the entire damn thing negative pressure, essentially. All right, now the problem becomes the health workers, but I would assume that they can set up an area with pressure isolation and essentially a decontam and a red and green zone, and for the people that are working in there, and everybody who's working in there knows damn well what they're dealing with. Okay, there aren't any surprises. And again, this is a facility that currently has nobody and nothing in it. Okay, it's a closed facility. My guess is that injunction gets struck, but it was one of those deals where the city went batshit instantly as soon as they found out. And, the people went in and filed an immediate injunction, and a judge thought about it for about 5 minutes and said, you know what, I could die, and gave it to them. They'll have it till Monday, and my guess is it gets lifted. But that is the environment we may be working with, folks. And that's extremely bad if you happen to be one of those people that gets a relatively mild case. You're going to have to triage yourself, because if this thing gets going, and you go into a medical facility, and that's the kind of situation you have. If you have a relatively low viral load and you take a big one, you might get really sick. All right, so remember, we already have a problem in this country with hospital-acquired infections. Big deal with that, all right, especially things like MRSA, which, by the way, kills a fair number of people every year in this country. And you get it in the hospital, which... Yeah, we don't talk about that. People can't be responsible for their own infection control when they're actually treating you, right? It's one of the things we sort of suck at. Western medicine is good for exactly one thing, and that is trauma. We have the best trauma departments anywhere in the world. If you get shot or you get in a bad car wreck or whatever, you want that to happen in the United States. Everything else, not so much. Anyway, that's what we got for today, folks. Most of this is virus today because I think there's some important information here. Again, still nothing to invalidate my hypothesis that's shown up in the data. And by now, if I was wrong, it should have been in evidence here in the United States. But stay the hell away from the homeless encampment hellholes like San Francisco and L.A. Okay, and by the way, now Austin, any city that has this kind of a problem, stay out of those areas, completely out. And our governments, I'll tell you what, if you are one of those sanctuary city kind of guys, I hope you end up being held accountable if and when, and unfortunately I suspect it's going to be when rather than if, you get these outbreaks in your cities and in those areas. Because if you think that we're immune from this thing, you're wrong. The only thing that's keeping it out from being a real problem in the Western world right now is white man sanitation good, and in the places where that's not true, that defense is going to fall. I'm your ticker guy. Have a good day.